AMD today announced 3 new X3D CPUs in the Ryzen 7000 series. They also announced some non-X CPUs. They're cheaper, lower power consumption, and they might be able to achieve most of the 7600X, 77, and 7900X performance without the extra price tag, because it's kind of like eco mode, basically. So we'll be talking about those. They additionally announced some new mobile RDNA3 GPUs and some new laptop CPUs that get into kind of confusing naming territory, so we're going to run through it all today for you. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now. And we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. We'll get straight into it and start with the X3D CPUs. These are the most interesting for our audience because they're desktop enthusiast parts. So they announced 3 of these this time. Last time there was only the 5800 X3D. Quick recap, it really dominated in a lot of gaming. It managed to outperform a lot of AMD's newest CPUs in the 7000 series even when they launched. And up until they stopped basically selling them or making them, they were one of the top gaming CPUs you could buy. So AMD's trying to revive that run with the 7000 series. The thing they do for this is strap a whole bunch of cache on top of the existing dies, and they keep the same Z height, so even though there's an extra stack of cache on top of there with different sanding techniques of the materials in between, they're able to keep the packaging all the same size. So AMD will be launching 3 models sometime in February. There's the 7800 X3D, the 7900 X3D, and the 7950 X3D. This is the slide that they gave us before their presentation with all 3 and the base specs. The 7950 X3D has 16 cores. It'll boost up to 5.7 gigahertz, and the combined L2 and L3 cache is 144 megabytes. That is massive for a desktop CPU. For perspective, we went and looked it up. The Threadripper 3970X has the same amount of cache. So that's where we are on the desktop parts now. A quick note here too. AMD pre-briefed us and other press, but they told us we needed to watch their announcement publicly when it goes live anyway in case there's additional info. One of the pieces of information, really one of the only ones they didn't give us about these CPUs, was the price. So if they give that pricing information in their live event, that should have just ended when this video goes up, check our pinned comment at the top of the video. If there's no new info, we'll let you know, and if there's new info, we will pin it with pricing if it comes out in that top comment. Okay, so for the rest of these, the 79X3D has 12 cores, so it's the same as the 7900X in that regard. It boosts to 5.6 gigahertz, and it runs 140 megabytes of combined cache. So that 4 megabyte reduction from the 16 core should just be from having 4 fewer cores, since each core on Zen 4 has 1 megabyte of L2, meaning that the L3 is just as large. The big change here is that this is the first time AMD is putting this many cores with this much cache in the desktop class, without going full Threadripper, where you typically would sacrifice some of the frequency anyway. So this, in theory, it should be a fairly no compromise, other than maybe money, approach to a super high-end gaming CPU. We'll see how it does. The architecture is different this time, so it might not be as impressive, or it could be more impressive. But the big limiter last time was X3D could have been useful for a lot of production workloads, but because it was relegated to an 8-core part, it really only had so much value it could provide to professional users who need the cores and would also like the cache. So that's what they're trying to solve with the 12 and the 16. And of course, we'll benchmark them as soon as we have them and let you know how they do. Finally, the 7800 X3D is most similar to the previous generation with 8 cores. Strangely, the listed max boost frequency is only 5 gigahertz for this, and AMD told the press this, quote, "It doesn't really need to boost super high in order to get that game performance because there's so much memory on the chip." That could be valid reasoning, we'll see once we review it, but cutting the boost by 400 megahertz versus the 7700X feels a little strange, considering that the 12 and the 16 core options didn't get their frequencies really cut at all. Now that said, as we've talked about in the past, Zen 4 boosts opportunistically, as all the other Zens do, except this time it is really contingent on the thermals, and we also know that 3D V cache is very thermally sensitive, so maybe that's playing into it somehow. Beyond the boost clock, AMD oddly also didn't list a proper base clock in the slide we had. Maybe this will change when it goes public. They only said 4.x gigahertz. So we assume that means it's not final, and we'll see what it changes to. But moving on to the power, all three of the X3D CPUs have a reduced TDP versus some of the higher end stuff that's already come out. So these are all set to 120 watt TDP. That means that they are falling between the 105 and the 170 watt levels that we saw previously with the 7000 series. And AMD had this to say about it. Quote, "We heard you guys. You wanted chips that are more efficient, that don't use a lot of power for no reason," end quote. As long as the performance is there to back it up, we won't disagree. In our eco mode testing previously, we found that AMD maintained most of the performance at its mid-step eco mode setting for the 7950X. And as a reminder, AMD's TDP is not indicative of actual power consumption and is constructed in such a way that AMD can basically arbitrarily decide what the TDP will be and manipulate the formula to hit the number they want. So TDP not equal to power. We say that every time, but it's important because it's obviously very confusing because it has watts at the end of it. Back to performance. AMD shared a couple of first-party numbers. We won't get too in-depth with them because we'll have our own numbers as a third party. And as usual, we need to look at them in reviews, but let's just look at a couple of theirs. For the 7800X3D, AMD claims 21% higher performance in Rainbow Six Siege, 22% higher performance in Dawn of War 3, 23% in CSGO, and 30% more in Dota 2. CSGO and Dota both tend to be CPU bound, but in different ways, and 3D V-Cache doesn't get fully leveraged in every game. In our 5800X3D review, we saw a major uplift in Far Cry 6, versus the normal 5800X, but we only saw 4% in 3 Kingdoms, so it just depends on the game you're testing. AMD also showed some comparisons of the 7950X3D versus the Intel 13900K in both games and in production workloads. AMD claims a 13% advantage in Rainbow Six Siege and a huge 52% advantage in 7-zip file compression, but that last one is so much higher, it makes us suspect if there's maybe some very specific settings engineered for the biggest delta. So again, don't read into the numbers too much when they're first party, but we don't have any way to validate them at this point. That'll come later. AMD also announced the 7600, 7700, and 7900 non-X parts. These are cheaper versions of the existing X SKUs that we already reviewed a couple months ago. They're lower power, and AMD said, quote, "We've taken the X off." So really technical, try to follow along. What they mean when they say that is there was an X, there is no longer an X. So hopefully everyone is on the same page. All three of these new CPUs ship with a 65 watt TDP and they still have integrated graphics. First, the R5 7600 is a 6-core CPU. It has a listed boost of 5.1 gigahertz and they say it's $230. That's $70 less than the official pricing of the 7600X. However, keep in mind that the street pricing recently, meaning the price you could actually get it for from a retailer up until like a couple days ago, was $240 in some places. So coming down to $230 when it was just $240, $250 doesn't really feel like there's that much change because the official price is irrelevant if it's sold for cheaper than that. But we've noticed the price trend starting to creep up, at least with some US retailers. So maybe conveniently, just before the launch of these CPUs, the X SKUs will find their way back up in price as consumers are trying to decide if they want to upsell themselves. Anyway, the 230 mark is more in line with where the R5 pricing should be and used to be. It gives people a lower cost entry point to AM5, which is a good move for AMD. And this could help users who want to buy a brand new system on a budget but not invest in a technically dead-end platform, being AM4 if you wanted to go that route. So the 7600, it's going to include a Wraith stock cooler. There are no included coolers with the existing 7000X CPUs, so that's different. They're including specifically the Stealth. It's one of the lower end, less interesting ones, but it might save you $20 on a super basic cooler or something. They're not impressive, but they'll get the job done, especially if you're sticking to that 65 watt TDP and you're not going into PBO. The R7 7700 is next with 8 cores and a boost of 5.3 gigahertz. It's priced at $330, which is also $70 less than its X counterpart, and the street pricing variable, obviously. The 7700 will come with a Wraith Prism stock cooler. Still not amazing, but better than the Stealth. and this one will have to work pretty hard to beat the 13600K at the same price point. Finally, the R9 7900 rounds out the non-X list with 12 cores and a 5.4 GHz max boost frequency for $430. It also comes with a Wraith Prism. This one might be interesting based on the pricing and the power limit, and a 65 watt TDP could actually be a real limiting factor for a 12-core CPU, so we'll see how PBO might affect it too. And speaking of, AMD will be allowing these to be overclocked, so PBO will work on them. They're not locked down or restricted in any new or special ways. They behave like the X SKUs. In theory, they might be lower quality silicon. Sometimes companies will bin them down and say that's not quite what we need for an X SKU. So maybe you get something that doesn't OC quite as well as an X, but PBO will work. So realistically, you should be able to kind of boost up to the level of the X SKU anyway, if you wanted to expend higher power. And likewise, you could bring an X SKU down to meet these in performance. Although, why would you do that if you just spend less money instead? So all three of these will launch on January 10th. Reviews, in theory, will post around that date or maybe a little before. AMD also talked about laptop CPUs in the 7000 series. There are a lot of them. It gave us flashbacks to the AMD decoder ring for a CPU naming schema. It's an actual thing. They gave us a decoder ring, the tactical press that talks about this stuff all the time, to understand their names. It's a different video. It's pretty fun though. Anyway, here's a slide with all of the mobile part names. The big thing here is that even though they're all 7000 by name, there will actually be new part numbers for the CPUs with the older architectures. The third digit tells you the Zen core generation. So 7X2X would be Zen 2 based. It's not that they're literally reusing old chips, because there are Zen 3 Plus and Zen 2 parts with DDR5 support on a 6nm node and with RDNA3 graphics. And all those things mean that it's new silicon, it's structured a little differently. So that said, the 7030 series might literally be rebadged due to the use of DDR4 and Vega graphics. That might be an older part getting resold. There are models in the 7045 series that scale all the way up to 16 cores, but we think the most interesting of all of these are the 7040 series chips. The 7040 series mobile CPUs will be available in 6 or 8 core versions with 12 RDNA3 compute units, a first for any mobile CPU or APU from AMD. They're manufactured on a 4nm node, and they feature some new dedicated AI silicon with AMD's new adaptive AI architecture that it calls XDNA. AMD made some big statements with this. They refer to the implementation as Ryzen AI, and the company leans pretty hard talking about the benefits of a dedicated AI engine. It related it back to equivalence with when the industry first introduced dedicated specialized GPUs. So that is a pretty big statement to make, because they're basically saying it's the first step in a revolutionary new component for computers. Be cool if there is a revolutionary new component for computers. We'll see if it starts here or not though. The point AMD is making is that they are betting that hardware acceleration for client-side AI tasks will be needed to reduce bogging down the CPU or the GPU at some point in the near future. AMD mentioned using this AI engine for things similar to ChatGPT or DALL-E 2. Neither of those specific projects have open models, so AMD fell back on vague, quote, magical experiences in video chat applications like Teams. And every time I hear the word magical in marketing, I get Apple flashbacks to when they introduced their magical mouse. I don't know what was magical about it actually, but they said it was. So moving on, RDNA3 GPUs. Finally, AMD talked a little bit about RDNA3 coming to laptops as well. There are 4 models here. There's the 7600M XT, the 7600M, the 7700S, and the 7600S. The lineup's a little confusing, but then again, so is NVIDIA's lineup, where they have 4090 laptop SKUs that are just called 4090 laptop, and they are basically a 4080 desktop part. Just lie, right? Like, why? Who's gonna call you on it? Anyway, AMD's name's maybe not quite that far. We'll see. But for these, they say that M GPUs are for, quote, high FPS 1080p gaming, and they say the S GPUs are for thin and light high frame rate gaming. Apparently, what's really going on here is that the S GPUs are the same as the M GPUs, but are specifically tuned for power or thermally constrained situations. It's very unlikely we benchmark these. We don't tend to look at laptops anymore these days, but based on AMD's own numbers, it seems like there's a very slight performance advantage to the 7600M XT over the 7700S. As a final note, the slides we saw had the 7600M and 7600S listed as having a 1280-bit memory bus. That is definitely a typo. There is zero chance that that's real. That's like maybe HBM territory, but it's a typo. So if you see any comments circulating about that, just ignore them. But anyway, that's AMD's announcements for CES. There's gonna be a lot more this week. We'll keep posting news as more stuff comes out. And thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab one of these disappointment build t-shirts with the 3 GPUs on the front, glitching and artifacting, and the dates for the worst launches of last year on the back. And thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.